Good evening. I'm Serena Field, and it's wonderful to welcome you to tonight's event at the Edinburgh International Book Festival, sponsored by The List. Tracey Thorn is best known as one half of the duo Everything But the Girl. Between 1982 and 2000, they sold over 9 million records and toured the world. But in spite of all her great success, both in the band and as a solo artist, as Tracy said in her best-selling memoir, Bedsit Disco Queen, she always felt mostly on the margins. In this book she's going to talk about tonight, Another Planet, she explores how her life has indeed been shaped by the fact that she was born and spent her teenage years in a commuter village on the outskirts of London, Brookmans Park in Hertfordshire. Physically going back there for the first time in 3 decades led Tracy to write about how boredom and restlessness led to creativity, how her parents' post-war dream of suburban safety meant something very different to her, and yet how it embedded itself in her creative DNA. So to begin tonight's event, Tracy is going to do a reading from her book, and so please welcome her now, Tracey Thorn.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm going to read a couple of passages just to start with, just to give an idea, because I know, it's a bit weird when you start talking about a book that people don't even really know what it sounds like. I make quite a lot of use in the book of my teenage diaries, which I started keeping when I was about 13. So I'm going to read a section from the beginning, which gives you an idea of what those diaries were like. And then I'm going to read a short passage from later on, which talks a little bit about the relationship with my parents and what happened to it after my teens. Going right back to the start, I tried to picture myself on the day I first decided to keep a diary, 29th of December, 1975, when I was 13 years old. I must have been given it as a Christmas present, and although it was for the year 1976, its first few pages invited entries for the end of the previous year. So I began as the old year ended, just before it turned to face the new. I would have settled down with a pen, riffled through the year's worth of blank, empty pages before breaking it open at the very start, and then, 29th December 1975, went to St Albans with Debbie, got a belt, could not get a jumper or skirt. That's it. That's all she wrote. No starting with a bang, no announcing herself to the world or to a future reader, no declaration of intent. Instead, I draw a circle and leave it empty, my eye caught by an absence. And it wasn't an aberration. I carried on in that style for years, making countless entries about not buying things, not going to the disco, not going to school, a piano lesson being cancelled, the school coach not arriving. It's a life described by what's missing and what fails to happen. My second ever entry is just as banal. 30th of December, went to Welling with Liz, didn't get anything except a bag of Kentucky chips. 1st of January 1977, went to Welling with Mum and Dad to get some boots but couldn't get any. 8th of January, Liz and I went to Potter's Bar in the afternoon to try to get her ears pierced, but she couldn't. 19th of January 1979, Deb and I went to St Albans, tried to get some black trousers but couldn't find any nice ones. 17th of March, tried to go to the library but it was shut. Was it me or was it my surroundings? Was it just that I was the dullest child in existence, noticing nothing, experiencing nothing, thinking nothing? Or was it at least in part an embodiment of something in the air, something vague and undefined? Even when I write about it now, I realize that the time and place in which I grew up, 1970s Suburbia, is easier to define by saying what it wasn't than what it was. Brookmans Park was a village, but not a village. Rural, but not rural. A stop on the line. A space in between two landscapes that are both more highly rated, the city and the countryside. A contingent, liminal, border territory. In-between land. So I write quite a lot in the book about what happens during my teenage years, and my relationship with my parents falls apart a bit, as it does, and doesn't entirely recover, but I'm just going to read a passage from towards the end. The distance that had grown up between me and my parents in my teens never quite closed up, and it was due in part to my increased education and change of lifestyle. Like so many similar parents, they'd wanted me to do well at school and then go to university, to take those chances they'd never had. And then when I did, it turned me into someone they thought they couldn't understand. Later on, they'd be proud of my musical success, but perhaps more because it was success and therefore respectable than because it was artistically interesting to them. They liked the music when it was more mainstream, and they liked the gigs at the Albert Hall because they were tangible proof of achievement and status. And they enjoyed the sense of pride and reflected glory at the backstage party. And all of this was soothing and reassuring to them because it took away some of the fear that they had lost me to rock and roll. We never know our parents as we are growing up, only getting to understand them once we are ourselves standing in their old discarded shoes, and perhaps it can't be any other way. But if we don't know our parents, I do also wonder whether they ever know us. In later years, after my break to have children, when I went back to music and recorded an album called Out of the Woods in 2007, I sent them a copy, expecting a phone call or something a day or two later, hoping for parental praise, as you always do, as you still do, even when you're a grown-up and a success and a mother. It never came. They never mentioned it or said anything about the record. My sister Debbie told me later they'd found it hard to understand, and I was never sure what exactly was hard to understand, the music or the reason for making a record, the need, perhaps that. Later still, when I wrote Bedsit Disco Queen, my dad's only comment to Debbie was, "I never knew Tracey was so into music." Which still makes me laugh till I cry, for all it says about how much we can remain a complete and utter mystery to those who should know us the best. And then again, in even later years, he would say to Debbie, in reference to something or other I had done, some inexplicable action, some bizarre life choice. And this, remember, when I was a middle-aged, middle-class woman, married to the man I'd been with for over 30 years with 3 children, he would say, "Oh, Tracey, she's from another planet."
Thank you. Thank you, Tracey. You mentioned there that once you left home, there was a disconnect with your parents that never quite healed over. I know that you're much closer to your children than was the case for you with your parents. Do you put that down to sort of a generational difference? Parenting is different now, or is it something to do with the particular personalities involved in your family?
I mean, it is very generational. I was brought up in that atmosphere, which I do think was exacerbated by this suburban environment as well, where the great goal of life really was to pretend everything was fine. My parents' whole lifestyle was very aspirational. For them, the move out of London and into this nice suburb was about trying to achieve a nice life. And so from that point on, the amount of effort that went into making sure that everything was nice and that nothing difficult or nasty was ever discussed meant that the relationship we had seemed to operate at sort of surface level all the time. So you didn't get close because you didn't talk about anything difficult or problematic. And that was fine when I was a child. Everything was quite cozy and conventional and nice. But when I became a teenager and became just more curious about the world and especially, excited by music and art and culture, I wanted to start talking about things and throwing ideas around, and expressing myself. And just this kind of portcullis came down, you know, that we just don't go there. And I think that at that point, that sort of gap started to open up, which is embodied in those lines like not knowing that I was into music, thinking I'm from another planet, you know, where I was made to feel like I was sort of, you know, it had come from somewhere else. It was a sort of alien being for being interested in those things.
Because it's interesting, at one point in the book you mention that you realise you never mentioned your dad at all, really, in your teenage diaries. Why do you think that was?
Well, my dad was a bit of a background figure. He was a very quiet, shy man. And I think I had a much closer relationship with my mum, to whom as a child I was very close. And then my teenage rebellion, a lot of it was very much against my mum. And I realised, looking back, that a lot of what I was rebelling against, really, was the life she seemed to represent, which was my, you know, adult woman role model. And it was, to me, a terrifying option. It was stultifying, you know, just having given up work to have children, being a housewife, you know, being terrified to ever talk about anything difficult, whilst clearly, I think, herself suffering from anxiety issues and all sorts of things like that. So even in my rebellion, a lot of my rebellion was much more about my mum than about my dad, who remained a bit shadowy to me.
Because Suburbia was defined sort of culturally, wasn't it, as quite a female space? And you mention in the book that some of the images of women in suburbia that you would watch on the television in the evening with your parents. You're talking about, you know, George and Mildred and The Good Life and these kind of figures that they represented a certain image of suburbia to you. And so did your mum fit with those, really?
Well, look, you know, the women in those kind of cultural representations that I was seeing of suburbia are horrifying. You know, Margot Ledbetter, who, you know, lives next door to the Goods, was what my mum seemed to me to be aspiring to be.
Right.
I watched The Good Life with a sort of awful sense of dread that my parents were actually the Ledbetters or wanted to be, you know, whereas the Goods were clearly the goodies. That was, you know, they were the kind of moral centre of the thing. The Ledbetters were there to be laughed at, and yet what they represented was the classic suburban ideal. You know, it was about having a nice house, impressing the neighbours, joining the golf club, you know, aspirational stuff. And look, as a teenager, I objected to that enormously. When I came to write the book and started actually, you know, researching suburbia more and thinking more deeply about my actual parents and who they were and where they'd come from and how they ended up there, I started to take a more sympathetic view. You know, they'd both grown up in working class North London, had lived through the Blitz, had both been bombed, and in the late 1940s when they got married, they had the opportunity to then move out of London, which, let's face it, large parts of it were bomb sites, especially where they'd grown up. Lots of the streets they'd lived in barely existed anymore. They had the opportunity to move out and in the early 50s buy a little semi-detached house with a garden and a, you know, garage and a front wall. And of course I can understand now why they wanted that and why it represented something safe and, you know, a step up the ladder, a degree of comfort, a place that you could bring up children. I came to a much greater understanding of why they'd moved there, which then opened my eyes to the fact that the mocking of suburbia in itself has a certain viciousness to it and a certain refusal to understand why it is that people want a nice life for themselves, you know. I quote Kingsley Amis at one point. He says, you know, nice things are nicer than nasty things. And it's true, human beings, being what we are, you know, will generally choose nice things over nasty things.
You mentioned as well, you know, you're saying there that you have greater sympathy now, you know, with your parents than you had at the time when you were living with them in suburbia. You say that you could only write this book now that your parents are not around anymore. Is that to do with the not talking about anything difficult or feelings or anything that might be controversial?
Yeah, I would have found, you know, I'm their child, so I've inherited some of that difficulty in talking about difficult things. I certainly would have found it very difficult to write this book knowing that they would read it. It would have been painful for them, I think, to see articulated how much I hadn't been happy as a teenager. I think they would have found that very painful. As I say, they thought they were moving into a lifestyle that was going to be perfect for children and that we would all grow up happy in. And I think they had an inkling that I wasn't happy as a teen, but perhaps just tried to write that off as teenage rebellion that I'd then grown out of. But actually, you know, I do in the book talk about, you know, that gulf that opened up between us. And it's very difficult to talk about that when your parents are still alive. We did make our peace with each other, and we ended up with a relationship that was as close as it could be. There was still a degree of misunderstanding there. Yeah. The fact that even in late life, my dad could still feel I was someone from another planet. But we were basically kind and forgiving towards each other. And I think, you know, to write a very honest book is very difficult. It's the classic dilemma of any writer, really. If you want to write honestly about people close to you, that does pose a really awkward ethical question, you know. Not even just ethical, just personal. What's it going to do to your relationship with these people? Yeah. And it would have made it difficult. So I do think it's a classic book written by someone who wants to tell the truth about their parents, but can perhaps only do so once they're not sort of standing over your shoulder.
And you might think then, if you were frustrated or unhappy where you were as a teenager growing up, and that's something that you didn't particularly want your parents to know, you might think then that the diary would be packed with, you know, that you might pour your heart out into the diary. But as we just heard when you were sort of reading the excerpts there from the diary, that's not the case at all. So as a writer now, looking back at this document you created from the age of 13, what do you think of the voice that you read there now? Is she withholding still quite a lot of what you know was going on at the time?
Yeah, definitely. And, you know, when I came to read the diaries, and I started reading these entries about nothing happening, you know, the fact that I actually bothered to write down not being able to get a belt, I thought, this is a gift, actually, to a writer, because it immediately gets you started on this really interesting question of openness and, you know, disclosure and withholding. How much as a writer do you choose to tell? How do you decide what to tell? When you're writing a non-fiction book, people assume, well, you just write down what happened. But of course you don't. You're constructing a narrative all the time. And even in something as private and personal as a diary, there was part of me that was constructing a narrative, a really weird one a lot of the time. You know, so keen was I, obviously, not to go anywhere difficult, that I would actually note down something not happening. What's that about? The marking of something not happening seemed to me fascinating, you know, in this sort of obsession with absence, with nothingness. So it was a really good starting point. I thought it really opened up then the whole notion of what memoirs are about, you know, what non-fiction books are about. How honest do you think the writer is being? You know, my teenage diary writing self was often quite dishonest in describing things that had happened. I'm sure that's not uncommon, but, you know, I would write a few entries about a boy I really liked, and then it would go wrong, and then there'd be all the entries about why I didn't like him, you know, why I was, not interested in that anymore. And you just think, actually, I didn't have any sort of vocabulary in which to describe pain or disappointment or embarrassment or shame, any of those things. So you have to read between the lines of the diary. You know, it's all there. You can, as an adult reading it, you can imagine what this person is really feeling, but it's certainly not handed to you on a plate. You do actually have to do some imaginative work.
And it's almost as though at times you were sort of evaluating your behavior as you go along, because at one point you write about you say something happened that you're upset about and you write sob. Or if you do something that, it seems as though if you do something that you feel might be viewed by someone else, possibly your parents, with disapproval, you write tut as well. So there was a level of remove assessing your behaviour and what you'd been doing?
I mean, I think I was literally scared that my mum was reading my diary.
Right.
That's another explanation for some of the
Yeah.
absences.
Yeah.
I write quite early on that there was an instance when I wrote a very personal letter to a friend, quite melodramatically, saying, I think I'm going to kill myself, which honestly wasn't true at all. But I'd written it in a letter and left it unsealed on my bed. Interesting psychological question. Why are you leaving this unsealed on your bed?
Mm-hmm.
But my mum read it and confronted me with it. And from that point on, I always felt that my diaries were not necessarily private. I couldn't be sure whether or not she was going to read them. But then when I came to read them now as an adult, I felt that sometimes I was almost playing a game, of tempting her to read things and then confront me with them. There are some things I do write in the diary and then some things that are left out. And one of my favourite bits that I came across was an actual blank page. There was one day that I just left completely blank. Now, I remember why. I know what happened on that day and what I didn't have the words for or didn't want to describe.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I had a few interesting conversations during the writing of the book about how to present that. I didn't want to present it too dramatically to imply that on the day of the blank page something absolutely shattering had happened. It just seemed to me the absolutely perfect example of this kind of editing function that was going on even at the stage of writing an apparently honest diary.
And what do these diaries look like? I mean, how many have you got? Are they sort of exercise books? And the reason I'm asking...
No, they're this size. They're these little tiny pocket
tiny,
diaries.
right.
Tiny.
Right. Because they just seem to have been such important documents for you because out of them... both books, this book and Bedsit Disco Queen, draw from your diaries, and also your very first songs really grew from your teenage diaries as well. So it's intriguing to think that all of that really has come, and how much these diaries have shaped your life really as it's continued.
I mean, I think the most interesting thing is that I was actually more honest in my songs when I started to write them than I was in my diaries. That really struck me when I read them, that there's a point in the last couple of years of my diaries, the late 70s, 1979 onwards, when I was writing songs by then, and all the emotion was going into the songs, which were public. I was standing up and singing them in front of people and then recording them, and yet somehow felt actually more able to express or convey emotion in that format than in a diary, where still there are absences and a sense of something being withheld. So I think that's very interesting. It felt to me as though another thing they revealed was that I needed a more artistic, expressive outlet, really, in order to get this stuff out. The diaries were useful up to a point, and they're a great source of raw material for me now. But there's a point when they almost ran out of being useful to me, and I by that stage had begun to explore other ways of expressing all this stuff that was, very pent up in me, because at home there was no way of expressing it. And so music stepped in really and filled that gap, and I think allowed me to step outside of this, very mundane, very conservative, very conventional world, and into something that seemed limitless and expressive and magical. And that's what music offered me, really, was a route out of this really limited world.
And how would you describe yourself as a teenager? Because I really enjoyed reading the details about, you would go down the shops on a Saturday to look for clothes. Not that you got any, but that you were looking for the TV that you watched, that you did a paper round, that you had a Saturday job. I'm sure, that would bring back memories for a lot of people. How would you describe yourself as a teenager during those years?
Well, one of the things that I thought was really striking is those things that you just described are all there. They're the sort of innocent pursuits. They're going to the shops, they're walking the dog, having piano lessons, having a paper round.
Yeah.
And yet, the flip side is, at the same time, I was also starting to go to discos from the age of about 13 in the local hotel, where I was getting off with much older boys, men, frankly. There was a great entry I read, which, you know, being the age I am now, made me sit up very straight when I talk about, I was dancing with this bloke again, he's a bit of a creep, keeps bothering me. Turns out he's a policeman. And I was like, wait, you're 13?
Yeah.
And he's a policeman? So, you know, there was a really strange kind of flip side to this, the narrowness, which was that as young girls especially, we were both incredibly repressed in that we weren't taught anything and nothing was talked about, but we were incredibly vulnerable because we were out there in this world that as yet had no rules at all, certainly concerning the availability of youngish girls to be, you know, exploited in some ways. You know, we weren't unwilling, but we were too young, and we were, you'd say innocent, but honestly we were ignorant, and that sort of innocence, ignorance made us very vulnerable. So some of the diary entries, they veer wildly between, you know, reports of watching The Good Life and what's on at school, and then a night at the disco where I sort of sat there thinking, oh, God, really? And lots of underage drinking, and lots of underage drinking and then getting in cars with people who've all been drinking, and 8 of you getting in a car to drive to the next village where there's a pub. There's a Saturday night where we all go and have a look at the wreckage of a car crash that's happened, because that was Saturday night entertainment in the suburbs. And it was a group of friends that we'd all know. None of them were hurt particularly. But I casually end the diary entry by saying, I can't remember how many, there was 8 of them in that car or something. You're like, how? What? So there was a kind of recklessness, I think, in that time when, you know, as yet, certain things that we now take for granted, you know, health and safety issues, drink driving, you know, ID cards being needed to buy drinks in pubs. No one ever asked us how old we were. So we went to we didn't drink at home, we just went to the same pubs all the adults went to and got served. So it's a really strange mixture. I think, you know, that was something I tried to capture about the weirdness of the time, that in some ways it was very unliberated and very repressed in that we never talked about anything, but at the same time there were no actual rules that might have kept us safer. And as young girls especially, we didn't really have any power or agency. We just had a lot of rebellious urges that were kind of, we were going out there into the world with. But, you know, we weren't really in control of our destiny at that point.
You're talking about the strangeness of the time, but in the book also you muse on the strangeness of the place, of Brookman's Park.
Yes.
And so you've talked there about the Brookman's Park Hotel Disco. That's where you went. But you also mentioned that there were no arts venues, for example, there. I mean, how significant was that for you growing up as somebody who was obviously interested in the arts?
Well, you know, that's classic suburbia, I think. One of the sneery definitions of suburbia is it's somewhere with, you know, no educational facilities and no culture. And I mean, it's true there wasn't, because Brookman's Park was quite small, so it didn't have a club or a theatre or a cinema. You had to go to the nearest town for that. The odd thing, I suppose, was being so near to London, and we were only 25 minutes away on the train. It had that sort of, you know, little satellite town feeling that you were just close enough to where it was all happening. That, you know, it's like just being pressed up against the window. You could see that London was happening. And so especially when exciting musical things began to happen, you know, punk in the late 70s, and I started then going to gigs, London was near enough that that's where I sort of went to get my culture. And I think because of that, it made London seem, you know, a very magical place to me. I think I was a classic example of one of those suburbanites who ends up massively romanticizing the city that they live near, because it just seemed to me the ideal place. Obviously, you'd want to get to London because everything was happening there. And I just couldn't understand why both my parents, who'd grown up there, you know, I'd hear all their stories about where they'd grown up, and them doing all their courting in Kentish Town, and the first time they ever met was in an underground station, and I just thought, it's so romantic, it's so exciting, why did you leave?
And of course, being in a band and showing off is classic teenage rebellion. Do you feel you would have done it anyway, whatever the circumstances you grew up in, because it was always in you, you loved music, or was this a specific way to rebel when you started your own band, when you got your guitar?
Well, I don't know, and this is where we get to, it raises these really interesting questions about boredom and about lack of culture. Again, there's something about the time and the place. We all look back to that era before culture, music, films, art, fashion were so readily available, when we really did have to still do it ourselves. And so the late 70s, punk movement and what came after it was very much about do it yourself. So we formed bands because not many bands came to play nearby us that we could go and see. So we formed our own bands. And literally, the first ever gigs I did were just in people's houses, just at parties, playing our songs to each other. And we made our own clothes, it was. And then when we started recording, we recorded things in our own bedrooms and went to a tape copying service and got 50 copies made and then made the sleeves ourselves. Yeah. So, there is something about that absence of available entertainment and culture that in some ways can be inspiring.
And you really did figure it out yourself, didn't you? You just had an inclination that you just felt you needed to have a guitar, and you bought one, but you didn't know really that it needed an amp or a lead to play, so you played it sort of in silence in your room.
I did. We're back to ignorance again, which sometimes can be a spur to creativity. I always think that there was something about not knowing the rules, especially as girls. I remember as girls we felt very left out of the kind of rules of being in a band. I joined my first band and I was the only girl, and the boys were the same age as me, but somehow they seemed to have already got information about amps and technology, and they talk in language that I was like, have you had a meeting when I wasn't here? Have you kind of decided? And they'd already decided what records were cool. And I remember just, again, that feeling of nose pressed up against the window. But it just made me feel a bit defiant. It made me feel like, I'm not going to let you just dictate what's the way this happens. And that actually maybe there's something about not knowing the rules that means you come up with something new. The danger of knowing the rules is you follow them.
Yeah. And that's
what music can get into, how it can get into a rut. So by not knowing the rules, it did make us break them.
Yeah, or not being influenced by what's necessarily around you, because as well, for example, when you went to university in Hull and you met Ben, you felt that your musical style evolved because not many bands came to play in Hull.
I went from one isolated place to another.
Yeah.
Hull's a little bit one of those just tucked away in its own little corner. And I do remember we'd get the music papers and look at someone going on tour, and they do Manchester, Sheffield, Leeds, Liverpool, but Hull, not often. So we would, by that stage we would go to places like Manchester and Liverpool to see bands. But again, I think it meant we slightly evolved just to one side of being part of a scene. And again, I think there is something interesting to be said about the sort of outsideriness that cultivates art. Being part of a scene can be great and it can be really exciting, but on the other hand, it can also create a kind of homogenous sound and style. You get scenes in cities that grow up where you can say, oh, well, all those bands sound like they come from there, which, can be great and exciting. But then what we all want all the time is progress and new ideas and someone to not sound like anyone else. So again, there's something about just being on the outside of things that I think can be a spur.
Yeah. And something I notice about your writing, particularly when you write about your music career and all the successes that you've had, you're very matter-of-fact about it. So, for example, in the beginning with the Marine Girls, your early band, the fact that your music career was taking off in your late teens, and you went to university anyway and kept it going. Was that just your personality to take it in your stride, or was it the suburban thing of not sticking out, not showing off too much, and just getting on with it?
I mean, a bit of both. Definitely the not showing off thing went very deep with me.
Yeah.
I suspect a lot of people my age from a similar background would remember that feeling. You know, that not showing off, drawing attention to yourself was, you know, a very big thing and to be aimed for. And I do think that sort of stuck with me. I never quite bought into the notion that, you know, that it was a good thing to massively draw attention to yourself. And underplaying things seemed to come naturally. But it was also the spirit of the time. Mm-hmm. I think it's very easy looking back, especially on people's music careers, to, if they've ended up becoming successful, to see it as inevitable from the beginning. But it doesn't seem like it at the time. You know, the success that, for instance, the Marine Girls were having was tiny. It really was tiny. And we're one of those bands who have sort of become bigger in retrospect, you know, long after we split up. You know, now you can tell amazing stories like, oh, well, we were Kurt Cobain's favourite band and stuff like that. And so it makes it sound all very big and glamorous. But one of the reasons we were his favourite band was because no one had heard of us. So it was a cool thing to be into. Mm-hmm. So at the time when I went to university, it didn't feel like, you know, I was turning my back on some amazing career.
But when you went, you were keen to sort of turn your back on Suburbia and kind of get away, and you didn't go back. But you also say that you describe it as a sort of a mini breakdown at the time, just when you went to university. Mm. What was behind that when you'd been aching to escape for so long?
I mean, I think that's really interesting. You know, for someone who was desperate to get away, when it came, when I really did escape, and not only did I escape physically, but the breach between me and my parents opened up even wider. They disapproved massively of Ben, hilariously, because that's clearly not going to last. And we did the thing they disapproved of, which was moving in together as students, living together, not getting married. My parents were conventional enough to really, really object to that, even as late as, you know, the early 80s. And from that point, you know, what had been a rift between us became a massive rift. And instead of reveling in my newfound freedom and having shaken them off, I do think I had a bit of a breakdown at university. I didn't really talk to anyone about it because no one did in those days. I suffered panic attacks without telling anyone and really went through a lot of stuff just very privately, which was the way people did in those days. You know, no one said, oh, you ought to go and talk to someone. Maybe this is a mental health issue. But I think, you know, however much you rebel against parents, it's not an easy or happy thing to do. I always talk about myself as being a rebellious teenager, but I wasn't a very happy rebel. I would have been much happier in a family where being into music and buying a guitar was just sort of accepted as okay and fine and not a big deal. Mm-hmm. I kind of rebelled because I had to, because I knew I had to do all this stuff. But I didn't rebel for the sake of it, just because I wanted to. It was just a means to an end. And I honestly would have been a lot happier not having to be so rebellious.
And how do you feel about your upbringing in Suburbia now? Do you see it as a kind of gift in that it gave you a stable upbringing? No, but it spurred you on, didn't it, to achieve everything you have?
Yeah, but you know, I also don't like sentimentalizing things afterwards just because they kind of turn out okay. I mean, I read a lot of things now. People talk a lot about boredom and, you know, in the sense of looking at what young people have now and saying, oh, well, they're so spoilt by having so much culture on offer, so much freedom, you know, it's going to thwart their creativity. They don't know what it's like to be bored. And I look at my kids and I'm so envious of them, honestly. I mean, they're not thwarted at all. They're all really creative. They're all really busy. But they're happy. And they've got the approval of their parents, which I think is a good thing. I don't think you have to force people to suffer in order to create art. I know I've said that the being on the outside was a spur, but it was only because we had to force ourselves to do it. So I do think there's a danger in romanticizing that being thwarted and implying that, unless you're thwarted, you're not going to create art. People do create things in terrible circumstances or despite things, but, that doesn't necessarily mean that, therefore, you should be grateful for it. In writing the book, I became very forgiving of my parents.
Yeah.
It ends up being a much more forgiving book than you'd imagine from the actual diary entries. I end up making a lot of my peace with them. But there are some things about the way I was brought up that I really don't forgive, that I do think were unkind and unnecessarily harsh and did me harm. And, so I don't want to romanticize it and look back and go, well, it was all fine because I got a good song out of it.
No, because there was one moment where, when you go back to Brookman's Park, which is a thread that runs through the book, 30 years after you left, you go back and you walk down the road to your house, and this is the house you were born in the front room, and you grew up in. And I was really interested that you gave it half a sentence.
Yeah.
I mean, that's very significant then, that you don't sentimentalize the place that you grew up, and you don't see it through, with the passage of time, you don't see it with rose-tinted spectacles.
No, I really don't. I actually surprised myself by how much I didn't mind the place when I went back. When I went back on my train journey the day, I really thought I was going to spend the day being angry and furious and sort of stamping around the streets the way I used to. And actually, as I walked through the village, I did feel quite at home. I had a sense of, really strong recollections of what it was like to live there. And a place does imprint itself on you. There's part of the place that's in my bones. I talk about having suburban bones at one point. There's part of it that I can't shake off. But I'm honestly not sentimental about it, and certainly not about the house. I remember just standing outside it thinking, it just feels so long ago. It feels almost fictional, really. Yeah. Did I really grow up? Was I born in that room there?
Yeah. In a moment, there'll be an opportunity to ask Tracey your own questions. Just while you prepare your questions, I just wanted to ask you one more, actually, Tracey, which is about class. And it's really interesting that you say that you grew up with certain ideas about class within the suburbs, these very subtle distinctions among your neighbours, particularly in what's signified by the choice of plants in the garden. And when you when you left and you look back, you started wondering about being called Tracey and what that said about you in terms of class. Can you say more on that?
Yeah, I mean, the word class was never used. I never heard my parents refer to anyone's class at all. But the word my mum did use about people was common. Anyone considered to be below us was common. Now, my parents were both working class. They'd come from working class London. My mum would answer the phone going, Potter's Bar, 54619. And they would go, oh, hello, Mum. It was her mum.
Yeah.
So, that was the class she was from.
Yeah.
And yet the move out to the suburbs, as I said, was aspirational. And so the idea was that you moved into a new class. So, one of the favourite things in Brookman's Park was looking down on other people. We lived the wrong side of the village. And there was a wrong and a right side, even in this little village. We lived in the little, tiny, semi-detached houses this side of the shops. And the other side of the shops was a big avenue leading up to the golf club with the detached houses, which was where my mum always wanted to live. So I think my parents had a lot of class anxiety, as those kind of people did. They'd left behind or tried to leave behind where they'd come from and ended up in a place where they could never quite be posh enough. And I think that damages people. They lost any sense of belonging or community that they might have had in where they came from and ended up in a place where all their effort was going into keeping up with the posher people up in the avenue. And so one of my mum's favourite things was saying, no, you can't play with so-and-so because she's common and things like that. And then, of course, hilariously, they give me the name that for the rest of my young adult life especially is the marker of young working class womanhood. Sharon and Tracey are the most common names you could give your child. So that just struck me as slightly comic. But yeah.
You know, when you went back to the house and you gave your house half a sentence, the second half of the sentence was you said, you noticed that the house next door could do with some doing up. Yeah, so exactly. Do you think that was you with you?
That was me saying it looked a bit common, frankly.
All right, Tracey, let's take some questions from the audience. If you'd just like to put your hands in the air so we can see you, and we will line up a couple of questions at a time. Okay, well, let's start with a question just here. Anybody else like to take the mic? Right, we'll go for that one after that.
Can you tell me if your purchases from the money you made from your newspaper round would indicate the career that you had in any way?
Sorry, if the purchases
what you spent the money you made from your newspaper round.
Yes.
Were you buying lots of records and stuff like that?
I did. Well, I mean, some records. I think, again, the interesting thing about those days is we didn't have very many records. What I could earn from my paper round didn't run to buying lots of records. So I still remember buying mostly singles as well, because albums were a bit too expensive. So I had a good singles collection from that period. And I can remember having for a while, about 5 albums and just playing them to death. And then, obviously, taping other people's albums, although home taping was killing music. But, you'd share, if everyone had 5 albums, you'd share them and tape them. But yeah, so the things I spent my money on were buying records, buying the music papers. The NME every week was essential to find out what was happening. And then tickets to gigs, which again I remember being such a performance, writing off with postal orders to get tickets. There's great diary entries where I say, me and Amanda and Dee have all decided we're going to see the Boomtown Rats, and I'm sending off £7.50 to Hemel Hempstead Pavilion. And I would order records from the little small ads in the back of the NME. Again, and you'd literally cut out the actual little ad and tick the record you want, and again send a postal order. So yeah, the money I did make went on, trying to buy music and, nights out involving music, which I guess in the end, you could say, did lead to the rest of my life.
Now, there's a question, just let me see. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, if you could put your hands up high, thank you. So, that one there. Thank you.
Hello, you said you couldn't write the book while your parents were alive, but it sounds like you've got a sister. How has she taken the book, and what's your relationship with her?
Yeah, I'm very close to my sister, and I did actually let her read it before, I'd sort of finished. She agrees with all of it. She went, oh, God, yeah. She had a very similar kind of teenage to me, but then I think actually she didn't rebel quite as much as a teenager. So she actually sort of came back into the fold a lot younger than I did, and made her peace with my parents a lot sooner. But certainly our experience of what it was like being a young teenager was very similar. Now, the interesting thing is I also have a brother who's 10 years older than me, and he read it and went, I just don't know what you're talking about. Which, again, I think says a lot about how children within the same families can have a very different experience. And I think the experience of being a girl in that environment was different. I think he was given a lot more freedom, and there was just a sort of higher expectation around him that he would, do things in life, and it was more welcomed. I think he just had sort of, this sounds a terrible word to use, but more respect from my parents in the way that in those days parents did sort of have a respect for their son's identity and autonomy and desire to be a person in the world. Whereas as girls in that era, we were incredibly oppressed and repressed. We weren't expected to want to do much, and everything we did want to do was a problem. And my sister identified with that completely and said, yeah, she completely understood. So I thought that was interesting. It sort of confirmed what I'd thought about, you know, that time being very particularly difficult to be a young girl.
Sorry, go.
I'm about halfway through the book, and I'm enjoying it hugely as a fellow child of Suburbia, where for me a big Saturday was going to the Glades in Bromley. Which
Come on.
I'm just past the section where you talked about things you've left out, which was where you'd experienced some bullying, but you hadn't written it in the diary itself. I wonder, was that suppression, that you weren't putting things in the diary, mirrored in the rest of your life? Were you talking about those tougher times with friends or with others, or was it something you weren't sharing with anyone at all?
No, I don't think we're sharing with anyone at all. Again, I think, you know, back to that concept of being brought up to think that you didn't necessarily discuss difficult things. I think that stayed with me for a really long time. It wasn't just embarrassment. My mum had a very strong sense of pride, I think, about not showing your weaknesses. Again, I wonder whether that's part of this thing of always feeling slightly socially anxious and wanting to put, you know, your best face onto the world. You show your best side, you know, you sort of big yourself up as much as you can. I think they had this strong sense that there was something shameful about admitting, for instance, to, you know, weakness or emotional difficulty. I've talked before about the fact that both my parents lived through the Blitz in London, and yet the way they talked about it to us as children was as though it was something out of an Ealing comedy. They told me ho, ho, ho stories about being blown out of their beds by bombs. And, you know, there was something about that generation that they were brought up to make light of really what I can only imagine must have been quite traumatic experiences. And I do think that fed on down through the generations for a while, you know, so that they'd repressed everything. So they sort of bought into the notion that that was a good thing to do, that the stiff upper lip was clearly the way to be and that it worked. You know, I don't think it did work. My dad was a silent, shadowy figure, I think, because he was quite a troubled man inside. My mum had a bit of a nervous breakdown when she hit her menopause. And again, instead of being offered any help, was put on Valium, the way women were in those days. So, yes, that degree of repression that I inherited from them, it took me years to shake it off, honestly. I think, you know, the music was a godsend in that it allowed me to let some of it out. But in terms of addressing it properly via therapy and stuff, I didn't do that till I was in my 50s. So, yeah, it goes pretty deep.
There's a question just here. If you could keep your hand up. Thank you. That's it. Thank you.
Hi, Tracy. I'm another Tracy with an E. So
It's the only correct.
absolutely, absolutely. And you've talked a lot about your parents, and I'm assuming you've learned a lot of lessons of, for the relationship with your own children, and ways not to be. But have you learned anything from them that was positive as well?
Oh, very much. I think as my parents were brilliant when I was a small child. I think that degree of, actually, quite conventional behaviour around children works quite well. I think, kids like routine and stability and, everything just ticking along. And I did replicate quite a lot of that with my kids when they were small. I was quite routine-y about everything. I did it, in quite a conventional way. The big difference for me came when they, sort of went past the age of 10, 11 and started moving into their teens. And I think then I was absolutely determined not to make the same mistakes. Like all parents try not to make the same mistakes that were made. So, again, the times had changed anyway, so it was a more normal approach. But just carrying on talking to them about things and listening to them. I've talked about how nothing was talked about when I was young, but one of the hardest things was that I was never listened to. I was never allowed to express a difficult opinion or say something questioning of their values or ideas and it be listened to. It was always shut down and seen as aggressive. So I think the biggest lesson I learned about parenting was listening to them, and I've tried to carry that on now. Again, it comes back to this thing of not dismissing the younger generation, you know, not dismissing their experience of the world, which also applies to what I was saying about not sentimentalizing your own, not constantly saying things were better when we were younger, or we were better, we were more creative, or you kids, you don't know, you're born with your internet and your phones, you know. No, don't do that. Don't do that.
Okay, yeah, there's a question just here. Thank you.
Hi, I was just curious as to whether your parents' relationship with your children enabled them to start opening up and expressing any emotion. I think sometimes, you know, I've seen it in my own family where you're actually kind of quite gobsmacked and sometimes irritated by the way in which your parent is able to relate to their grandchildren in a way that they haven't been to you.
I mean, I didn't really have that experience because being quite old when I had my kids, my parents were quite old already, so they didn't actually see my kids grow up really into being that age. And as I say, you know, when I was a small kid, my parents were fine. So around their grandchildren as small children, they were fine. They didn't live then to see their grandchildren grow up through their teens. And I can only imagine it would have actually been quite fraught, knowing what my teenagers were, who were all fantastic, but would all have thrown challenges at my parents that I think would have probably reignited some of the old stuff. But yeah, you're right. You know, if they'd suddenly been all forgiving about them doing their stuff, I probably would have found that quite tricky.
Well, that's all we've... Sorry, are you okay? So that's all we've got time for then. Thank you so much for coming and for your questions. Tracey will be signing copies of her book in the signing tent next door, just through there in a few minutes' time on the far side of the tent. So could you please join me in thanking Tracey Thorn.
Thank you. Thanks.